My twin brother visited me at the psychiatric facility, his face covered in bruises. When I discovered his abuser was his own son-in-law, I knew what to do. We switched places, and I taught that monster a lesson he will never forget. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated your worth and mistook your kindness for weakness. I am Nolan Becker, 73 years old, and a retired forensic accountant. I voluntarily checked myself into the Oak Ridge Care Facility 2 years ago after my wife passed away. The sprawling, manicured lawns and the absolute clinical silence of the private sunrooms offered the isolation I craved. I had spent 40 years dismantling complex corporate frauds, tracking hidden assets, and interrogating pathological liars in boardrooms. I was tired. I wanted to fade away quietly. But that peace was permanently shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when my identical twin brother Miles walked through the double doors of the visiting wing. Miles was always the gentle one, a retired high school history teacher who gave everything to his daughter Audrey. As he approached my table, he kept his head down, clutching a brown paper bag of pastries, his oversized aviator sunglasses hiding the upper half of his face. He moved with a stiff, protective gait. I did not need my old investigative instincts to know something was horribly wrong, but the cold, calculating machinery in my brain snapped awake the second he sat down. I reached across the table and gently pulled the sunglasses from his face before he could stop me. The swelling was severe. A deep, angry purple contusion bloomed across his left cheekbone, merging into a split, crusted lip. The tissue around his eye was completely swollen shut. It was a closed fist strike, a right hook judging by the specific angle of the impact and the secondary bruising along his jawline. I gripped his wrist, feeling his pulse hammering like a trapped bird. Miles tried to turn away, his voice shaking as he murmured an excuse about tripping over the garden hose on the back porch. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a low, flat baritone that I used to break embezzlers on the witness stand. Stairs and hoses leave random varied contusions, Miles. That is a targeted high-velocity impact. Who did this to you? He tried to pull his hand away, but I increased the pressure on his wrist, locking his gaze. Tell me. The fight drained out of him instantly. His shoulders collapsed, and the hollow, terrified shell of the brother I loved began to weep silently. It was Trent, he whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Trent Lawson, his son-in-law, Audrey's husband. Miles confessed everything in a rushed, terrified breath. Trent had demanded he sign over the title to his home. When Miles hesitated, asking to speak to Audrey first, Trent backhanded him across the kitchen floor. Audrey was upstairs. She never came down to help. My grief over my wife vanished in that exact second, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. Take off your sweater, I told him. He looked at me, bewildered by the command. Strip, Miles. Every piece of clothing. Watch, wallet, shoes. We are switching right now. You are checking into my room. You will tell the nursing staff you have a severe migraine and cannot be disturbed under any circumstances. I am going back to your house. I pulled off my tailored slacks and handed them over, demanding his faded baggy cardigan and worn corduroy trousers. He protested, his hands shaking, terrified of what Trent would do to me if I went back. I simply slid his wedding band onto my finger and adjusted his oversized glasses on my face. Trent doesn't know me, I whispered. He thinks you are a weak, isolated old man with no way out. He is about to find out how entirely wrong he is. A sharp knock hit the sunroom door right as we finished exchanging shoes. An orderly peered in, holding a clipboard. Mr. Becker, everything all right in here? I spun around, instinctively, hunching my shoulders, letting my hands develop a slight, pathetic tremor. I channeled every ounce of Miles's broken, defeated spirit. We are fine, thank you, I said, pitching my voice into a raspy, fragile register that perfectly mimicked my brother's exhaustion. Just helping my brother with his coat. The orderly nodded without a second glance and walked away. The disguise was flawless. I handed Miles my magnetic room key. Lock the door. Eat your meals inside. Do not answer it for anyone but the head nurse. I walked out of the facility, leaving my battered brother in an impenetrable fortress of medical security, and stepped into the afternoon sun, ready to hunt. I drove Miles's old sedan up the driveway of his suburban home, parking perfectly straight to avoid drawing attention. The house looked immaculate on the outside, a pristine two-story facade with freshly painted shutters. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the stench of expensive scotch and unwashed anger. Trent was sprawled on the living room sofa, a crystal tumbler in his hand, watching a sports game with the volume turned up too high. He was a broad-shouldered man, thick with muscle and unwarranted arrogance. He didn't even stand up when I walked into the foyer. "Where have you been, old man?" he snapped, not taking his eyes off the television. I kept my head down, shuffling my feet against the hardwood floor exactly the way Miles did. "Just getting some fresh air," I muttered. Trent slammed the glass onto the coffee table, the amber liquid spilling over the edge and soaking into the rug. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides and shoved me hard against the hallway wall. The plaster bit into my spine. I didn't brace myself. I didn't fight back. I went completely limp, absorbing the impact like a terrified victim, letting him feel entirely in physical control while I rapidly gathered data. "I need the bank access codes, Miles," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I'm done playing games with you. You're going to sign the property transfer on Friday, and you're going to give me the routing numbers today. Do you understand me?" I kept my eyes wide and fearful, shivering slightly, but my mind was recording every microscopic detail. The shove was forceful, but incredibly sloppy. He was drunk, impulsive, and undisciplined. And beneath the heavy smell of the scotch, I caught the distinct, cheap, synthetic lavender scent of a woman's perfume on his collar. It wasn't Audrey's. I remembered Audrey from family gatherings. She exclusively wore vanilla and sandalwood. This was cheap. A mistress. Trent reached into my pocket and ripped Miles's cell phone from my hands. "You're on restriction until Friday," he sneered, pocketing the device. He grabbed me by the collar of my cardigan and shoved me down the hall, throwing me into the guest bedroom. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and the deadbolt clicked into place. I was locked in, digitally severed from the outside world. Trapped. It was exactly where I wanted to be. I waited in the dark. I didn't pace the room. I didn't test the window locks. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress, listening to the architectural rhythms of the house. I tracked Audrey arriving home at 6, the muted arguments over dinner, the sound of the television blaring again, and finally the heavy drunken snores echoing from the master bedroom at 2 in the morning. I stood up and pulled a heavy metal paperclip from the desk drawer. I straightened it out, slid it into the cheap tumblers of the guest room lock, and applied lateral pressure. 3 seconds later, the mechanism clicked open. I slipped into the hallway, silent as a ghost, bypassing the squeaky floorboards I had already mapped in my mind. I crept into Trent's home office. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating his sleek laptop on the mahogany desk. I opened it. Password required. I didn't panic. Arrogant, impulsive men are rarely creative with their security. I typed in Audrey's birth date. Incorrect. I typed in his own birth date. Incorrect. I analyzed his overwhelming narcissism and typed the word winner followed by his birth year. The screen unlocked instantly. I pulled up his financial directories, my eyes scanning the spreadsheets with practiced speed. It was an absolute bloodbath. He had massive offshore sports betting accounts bleeding tens of thousands of dollars a week. I found final warning notices from aggressive unofficial lenders buried in hidden folders. He was drowning in debt. Then I found the folder labeled Estate Transfer. Inside was a completely fraudulent power of attorney, drafted and ready to be stamped by a corrupt notary this coming Friday. He was going to liquidate Miles's entire net worth, drain the accounts, use the cash to cover his illegal gambling debts, and disappear, leaving Audrey and Miles entirely destitute. Suddenly, the floorboards in the hallway groaned. The snoring from the master bedroom had stopped. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached the office. He was coming for a glass of water. I closed the laptop, erasing my digital footprint in a fraction of a second. The brass doorknob began to turn. I flattened myself against the wall perfectly behind the door, holding my breath. Trent stepped into the room, bathed in the yellow glow of the hallway light, scratching his neck. He looked at the desk. He looked at the window. He didn't look behind the door. He turned and shuffled toward the kitchen. I slipped out behind him, ghosting down the hallway and back into the guest room, pulling the door shut just as I heard the refrigerator open. I sat back on the bed in the dark and smiled. Trent thought he had locked a frail, broken old man in a cage. He didn't realize he had locked himself in a cage with a wolf. Sunlight crept through the gaps in the guest room blinds, casting pale, rigid lines across the hardwood floor. Nolan sat on the edge of the mattress, his posture intentionally slumped, mimicking the defeated slope of his twin brother's shoulders. The doorknob rattled. Audrey walked in. She carried a small plastic tray, holding a bowl of cold oatmeal and a glass of tap water. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the baseboards, her movements jerky and robotic. Nolan remembered the fierce, independent girl who used to dominate high school debate tournaments with a fiery brilliance. The woman standing before him was a ghost, entirely hollowed out by years of Trent's systematic psychological control. She placed the tray on the nightstand. "Eat this," she murmured, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "Trent says you need to stay in here today." Nolan let out a weak, rattling breath. He needed capital. He needed an untraceable lifeline to the outside world, and he had to secure it right now, utilizing the only asset he currently possessed, his brother's physical frailty. As Audrey turned to leave, Nolan triggered a violent, agonizing coughing fit. He doubled over, clutching his chest, forcing his face to turn a mottled shade of red. He let himself slide off the edge of the bed, hitting the floor with a heavy, alarming thud. Audrey gasped. Her purse slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents across the floor as she rushed to his side. "Dad," she cried out, her hands fluttering helplessly over him, terrified of what Trent would do if he heard the commotion. "Water," Nolan gasped out, gripping his throat with trembling fingers. "Please." Audrey scrambled up and ran toward the attached half-bathroom. The moment her back turned, Nolan's trembling vanished. His hands moved with the terrifying, practiced speed of a man who had spent decades dissecting corporate fraud. He swept his fingers through the spilled contents of her purse. He bypassed the credit cards, knowing Trent would track a digital transaction instantly. Instead, he extracted a crumpled $20 bill and a faded pharmacy receipt, shoving them deep into the pocket of his borrowed corduroy trousers. Audrey rushed back with a plastic cup. Nolan immediately resumed his act, letting his hands shake violently as he took the water. He spilled half of it down his chin, playing the pathetic, failing old man to absolute perfection. Better, he wheezed, leaning his head back against the bed frame. "Thank you, sweetheart." Audrey hastily gathered her spilled belongings, her hands shaking too badly to notice the missing cash. She practically fled the room, closing the door firmly behind her. Nolan listened to the lock click into place, his breathing returning to a slow, measured rhythm. He waited exactly 20 minutes. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Trent's expensive running shoes echoed down the hallway. The front door opened and slammed shut. Trent was gone for his morning run. Nolan stood up. The frail, stooped posture evaporated entirely. He moved to the window, watching Trent jog down the manicured suburban street, timing his pace. Nolan had 45 minutes at best. He approached the bedroom door, slipped a bent paperclip back into the cheap lock, and twisted. The mechanism yielded silently. He glided through this quiet house, bypassing the living room and slipping out the back door. The morning air was crisp, biting against his face, but he did not slow down. He navigated the backyard, unlatching the wooden gate that led to the alleyway. The neighborhood was quiet, a perfect facade of American domestic bliss, hiding the nightmare unfolding in his brother's home. Nolan moved with relentless purpose, pushing his 73-year-old joints to their absolute limit, keeping to the shadows of the alley, until he reached the main commercial street 2 blocks over. The bell above the corner store door chimed. The clerk barely looked up from his phone, indifferent to the older man in the faded cardigan. Nolan did not browse. He walked straight to the electronics rack, grabbed the cheapest prepaid burner phone available, and placed it on the counter. He slapped the crumpled $20 bill down next to it. "Keep the change," Nolan said, his voice flat and commanding, devoid of any elderly weakness. He tore the plastic packaging open as he walked out, discarding the wrapper in a sidewalk trash can. He powered the device on, memorizing the new anonymous number. The digital tether was established. He was no longer a prisoner. He retraced his steps, moving faster now, the adrenaline burning in his veins. He turned down the alley leading to the house. As he approached the wooden boundary, his heart hammered violently against his ribs. The gate was slightly ajar. He had pulled it shut, he was certain of it. The wind caught the wood, making it creak loudly. Trent was already back. Nolan slipped inside, closing the latch with absolute silence. He sprinted across the damp grass of the backyard, his lungs burning with the exertion. He reached the back door, slipping inside the kitchen, just as he heard the heavy, unmistakable thud of Trent's running shoes hitting the front porch. Nolan moved down the hallway with terrifying speed, a ghost sliding over the hardwood. He reached the guest room, threw himself inside, and locked the door behind him. He tore off his shoes, shoved the burner phone deep beneath the mattress, and threw himself under the heavy quilt. He forced his breathing to slow, mimicking the deep, rhythmic exhalations of a sleeping man. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. They did not stop at the kitchen. They came straight toward the guest room. The doorknob twisted violently. The door flew open, hitting the wall with a sharp, explosive crack. Nolan did not flinch. He kept his eyes closed, his face entirely slack. Trent stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his expensive running gear soaked in sweat. The heavy, sour smell of cheap cologne and aggression flooded the small room. Trent took a slow, deliberate step toward the bed. He hovered directly over Nolan. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Trent leaned in so close that Nolan could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could hear the erratic, angry rhythm of Trent's breathing. "I know you were out of this room," Trent whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "I saw the back gate swinging open." Nolan maintained the illusion perfectly. He let out a soft, confused groan, shifting under the covers, playing the role of an old man roused from a deep, oblivious slumber. What Nolan mumbled, letting his voice crack with authentic-sounding confusion. "Is it time for breakfast?" Trent stared at him, his eyes narrowing into dark, suspicious slits. He grabbed Nolan by the shoulder, his grip tightening like a vice, his fingers digging painfully into the bone. The threat was immediate, unyielding. Trent was testing him, searching for any flinch, any sign of clarity beneath the fog of old age. Nolan let his jaw go slack, letting out a pitiful, frightened whimper. Trent let go with a scoff of disgust, shoving Nolan back against the mattress. "Don't play games with me, old man," Trent hissed. "I am watching your every move. You won't ruin my payout." Trent backed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the frame shuddered. The lock clicked into place. Nolan opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The burner phone dug into his spine through the mattress. The trap was successfully set, but the margin for error had just vanished. Trent was actively hunting for a mistake, and Nolan was trapped inside the house with the contraband that would destroy him. I waited until the heavy thud of his boots retreated down the hall, and the front door slammed shut. The house settled into a suffocating quiet. I did not move immediately. Patience is the first weapon you learn in my line of work. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress, listening to the structural settling of the walls, waiting to ensure he had not merely stepped outside to wait on the porch. Once I was certain he had driven away, I slid off the bed and retrieved the prepaid phone from beneath the mattress. I moved into the cramped guest room closet, pulling the louvered doors shut behind me. The darkness smelled of mothballs and stale cedar. It was claustrophobic, but it was secure. I dialed a number I had not called in 2 years. It belonged to Fletcher Reed. Fletcher was a corporate bulldog, a man who could freeze a massive asset portfolio before his morning coffee. We had spent decades together tearing apart the financial illusions of arrogant executives. The line rang twice before his gruff voice barked a harsh greeting. I kept my voice to a razor-thin whisper, telling him I need a shadow audit and an ironclad freeze on a primary trust immediately. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The background noise of his busy office seemed to vanish. "Nolan, you old ghost," he murmured, his tone shifting from professional annoyance to genuine shock. He said he thought I locked myself away in that care facility for good and that the game was over when she passed. The mention of my late wife brought a familiar sharp ache to my chest, but I shoved it down. The paralyzing grief that had kept me isolated for 24 months was gone, completely replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. I told him I buried the man I used to be because I thought my family was safe, but the game is not over. I instructed him to pull up the financial filings from my son-in-law and find everything he could on Trent Lawson. Fletcher let out a low whistle, asking what Trent did to bring me out of retirement. "He made a severe miscalculation," I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth. He put his hands on my twin brother. The silence on the line grew incredibly dense. Fletcher knew Miles well. He knew how gentle and yielding my brother was. And more importantly, Fletcher knew exactly what I was capable of when my blood was up. I had spent 40 years dismantling men far smarter and far more resourceful than a suburban bully. Fletcher asked if I was wearing his face right now. I did not answer the question directly. I told him to lock down the master trust under my brother's name and to do it quietly. I needed him to put tripwires on every equity line connected to this residential property and then dig into Trent. I wanted every shell company, every offshore betting account, and every hidden liability dragged out into the blinding light to see exactly how deep this man was drowning. Fletcher said to give him 4 hours, his voice dropping into the familiar cadence of a man preparing for war. If Trent was hiding money, Fletcher promised to find the blood trail. He hung up. I sat in the dark closet listening to the absolute silence of the house. A short while later, Audrey came downstairs, moving around the kitchen. I could hear the timid clinking of dishes, the soft hum of the television turned to a low volume. She was existing in a state of permanent anxiety, tiptoeing around the edges of her own life to avoid setting off a landmine. I thought about the bruised, swollen face of my brother sitting in my secure room at the facility. Trent had isolated them both, feeding off their fear like a parasite. I remained in the guest room, playing the role of the broken old man whenever Audrey came to check on me. I kept my eyes vacant, my hands trembling, taking the food she offered without speaking a single word. She looked so incredibly tired, her eyes ringed with dark shadows, her shoulders permanently hunched. I wanted to tell her she was safe to drop the charade and promise her that the nightmare was ending, but I could not risk it. Trent had conditioned her to comply through years of psychological warfare. If she knew the truth, the sudden shift in her demeanor would tip him off instantly. I had to remain a ghost in my own brother's home. The burner phone vibrated against my thigh just after 3 in the afternoon. I retreated back to the security of the closet and answered. Fletcher said it was infinitely worse than I thought, his voice tight with urgency. Trent was not just playing with illegal sports books. He had leveraged everything to the absolute hilt, setting up 2 dummy corporations to funnel cash to his creditors, but the well ran dry 3 months ago. Fletcher revealed Trent owed upward of $500,000 to people who do not use collection agencies, but instead use crowbars and broken kneecaps. That explained the frantic desperation. The sloppy shove against the wall, the aggressive demand for the bank codes. Trent was a cornered rat. He needed liquid cash immediately to save his own skin, and my brother's estate was the only life raft in sight. I asked about the trust. Fletcher confirmed it was completely frozen, locked behind a labyrinth of biometric triggers and legal red tape. Trent could not touch a single cent without my physical presence in the office. I whispered that it was good, and to let him hit the wall. But Fletcher was not finished. He warned there was a massive complication. While tracking outgoing communications, Fletcher picked up a fresh digital trail. Trent wired $5,000 this morning to a man named Brody. Brody was a disbarred attorney who now operated as a corrupt notary public in the underground circuit. I asked why Trent was paying a dirty notary, my grip tightening on the small plastic phone. Fletcher replied that Trent was not planning to wait for Friday because he had bumped up his timeline. Brody was scheduled to arrive at my location tomorrow afternoon, bringing a blank deed transfer and a completely fraudulent power of attorney. Trent was going to force me to sign the house over to him in less than 48 hours, and Brody was going to legitimize the signature. The air in the closet suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. Tomorrow. I had operated under the assumption that I had until the end of the week to lay the groundwork for my trap. Trent was accelerating the board, bringing the executioner directly into the living room. Fletcher warned that if that paper got notarized, Trent could legally evict Audrey and liquidate the property within hours. The buyers were already lined up with shady developers ready to pay cash for the lot the second the title cleared. Once the ink dried, the house was gone, and Trent would be on a flight to a non-extradition country before the weekend. I closed my eyes, processing the compressed timeline. My brother had spent 30 years paying off this house as his sanctuary and his sole legacy for his daughter. Trent intended to steal it with a forged signature and a terrified old man. He thought he was dealing with Miles, assuming a few threats, and a raised fist would secure his absolute escape. I told Fletcher he was walking into a slaughterhouse, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. I instructed him to prepare the retaliation immediately by drafting warrants for wire fraud and elder abuse. I told him to contact his friends at the Federal Bureau and bypass the local precincts entirely, because Trent might have local officers on his payroll to look the other way when the notary arrived. I wanted federal agents ready to swarm the property on my signal. Fletcher asked if I was entirely sure I wanted to let it get that close warning that if I was in the room when Brody stamped that document, I was legally binding myself to a massive fraud case. He added that if my disguise slipped for a fraction of a second, Trent would know he had been played. I whispered that I wanted him to know, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white, but only when it was entirely too late for him to breathe. I spent 40 years dismantling white-collar criminals. I learned early on that arrogant men do not possess actual strength. They rely entirely on the illusion of control. When you disrupt their routine, their minds begin to fracture. They become paranoid. They make mistakes. Trent Lawson believed he was the absolute master of my brother's house. He thought he had trapped a frail old man in a cage. He had no idea I was systematically preparing to tear his life apart. I decided to accelerate his mental collapse. I started with the smallest details. Precision is everything in psychological warfare. Tuesday morning, Trent returned from his run and tossed his heavy leather keychain onto the kitchen island. He walked upstairs to shower. I slipped out of the guest room and picked up the keys. I walked into the mudroom and dropped them deep into the toe of his expensive golf shoes. 20 minutes later, the house echoed with his frantic cursing. He tore the kitchen apart, tossing magazines and slamming drawers. I sat in my recliner, wrapping a knitted blanket around my shoulders, watching him panic. He ended up leaving 30 minutes late for a meeting with his corrupt developers. The next day, I pushed the invisible needle a little deeper. Trent spent his afternoons pacing the patio, screaming at his phone and managing his drowning portfolio. He walked inside to pour another glass of my brother's premium scotch, leaving his tablet unlocked on the glass table. I moved silently through the sliding doors. My hands did not tremble. I opened his email application. His inbox was a disaster of final notices from underground sportsbooks and angry messages from his real estate broker. I found the thread containing the final confirmation details for the fraudulent power of attorney. I deleted the entire exchange. I went into the trash folder and purged it permanently. I set the tablet down in the exact millimeter of space where I had found it. I glided back to my chair just as he stepped back outside. Watching him frantically swipe at the empty screen an hour later was immensely satisfying. He slapped the glass table so hard it rattled. But the crowning moment of my quiet sabotage happened on Wednesday night. Trent was hunched over his laptop in the dark living room. The blue light from the screen illuminated the heavy sweat on his forehead. He was watching an illegal sports stream. I could see the digital betting slip open on his second monitor. He had leveraged thousands of dollars he did not have on the final quarter of a basketball game. The tension in his neck looked like a coiled spring. I shuffled down the hallway, dragging my feet against the floorboards, pretending to head toward the kitchen for a glass of tap water. The wireless internet router sat on a small decorative table near the hallway arch. As I passed, I deliberately stumbled, bumping my hip heavily against the table. My hand shot out, as if to catch my balance. I gripped the power cord and ripped it cleanly from the wall socket. The blue light in the living room vanished instantly. The stream died. The house plunged into absolute suffocating silence. A second later, Trent erupted. He roared like a wounded animal. He hurled his heavy glass tumbler across the room, hearing it shatter against the brick fireplace. He stormed into the hallway, his face twisted in pure, uncontrollable rage. I was already safely in the kitchen, pouring water into a plastic cup, my hands shaking with feigned terror. Trent did not look at me. He did not suspect the frail old man drinking water in the dark. Instead, he turned his fury entirely on his wife. Audrey came running down the stairs, pulling her robe tight around her chest. Trent backed her into the corner of the foyer. He towered over her, screaming that she must have forgotten to pay the internet bill. He called her useless. He told her she ruined everything she touched, and that she was the reason he was failing. I stood in the shadows of the kitchen, mapping the tragic fault lines of their marriage. Audrey did not defend herself. She kept her eyes glued to the floorboards, apologizing in a tiny, broken whisper. She accepted the blame for a mistake she did not make just to pacify his rage. My chest burned with a cold, lethal fury. I saw exactly what my brother Miles had been forced to witness for years. Trent demanded absolute submission. He used emotional blackmail and systematic psychological abuse to keep Audrey isolated and compliant. He was destroying her spirit piece by piece. The tactics he used mirrored the exact methods abusers deploy to isolate and manipulate vulnerable family members, restricting their confidence until they believe they deserve the cruelty they receive. I realized then that my mission was no longer just about securing my brother's financial assets. I had to obliterate Trent Lawson entirely to save my niece from a lifetime of servitude. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere in the house was highly volatile. The missing keys and the deleted emails and the failed bets had pushed Trent to the absolute edge of his sanity. His desperation made him unpredictable. He needed the cash from my brother's estate immediately, and his patience had completely evaporated. I was sitting in the living room staring blankly at the morning news when Trent walked in. He was holding a small orange plastic bottle. It was my brother's prescription heart medication. Miles had to take 2 pills every morning at 8 o'clock without fail to keep his blood pressure stable. The bottle always sat next to the coffee maker. Trent stood directly over my chair. His eyes were entirely dead. There was no trace of humanity left in his expression. He shook the bottle. The pills rattled inside, sounding like dry bones. He told me I was becoming a severe burden to his family. He said my mind was slipping, and my presence in his house was costing him time and money he did not have. He slowly unscrewed the white cap. He poured the tiny white pills into his massive palm, rolling them around with his thumb. He leaned down until I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. He told me it would be incredibly easy for a confused old man with a failing heart to simply forget a few doses. He said accidents happen to fragile people all the time, and sometimes their hearts just stop beating in their sleep. He was explicitly threatening to withhold the medication. It was exactly like the abusers who manipulate prescriptions to force a vulnerable elder into submission, or worse, to accelerate their death to access their money. Trent was casually discussing my murder as a convenient solution to his offshore gambling debts. I kept my face entirely blank. I let my jaw hang loose and allowed a thin string of saliva to pool at the corner of my mouth. I widened my eyes, mimicking the absolute terror of a helpless victim. But behind my vacant stare, my mind was operating with crystal clarity. Trent was not just a greedy coward trying to forge a real estate document. He was entirely willing to cross the line into homicide. He was willing to watch Miles die in this very recliner just to expedite the cash payout from the estate liquidation. He poured the pills back into the bottle and snapped the cap shut. He told me I would get my medicine tomorrow afternoon, right after I signed the power of attorney paperwork at the warehouse. He walked into the kitchen and placed the orange bottle on the highest shelf of the pantry, far beyond the physical reach of a crippled old man. He turned and walked out the front door, locking the deadbolt behind him. I sat alone in the silent house, wiping the saliva from my chin. The final boundary had been crossed. Trent had just signed his own death warrant. The air in the house was a suffocating pressure cooker by Thursday morning. Trent had left the kitchen in absolute disarray, leaving his gym bag kicked carelessly against the base of the washing machine. I needed to maintain the illusion of the subservient, battered father-in-law, so I gathered his discarded clothes. I moved methodically, sorting the heavy sweat-soaked fabrics. As I lifted a pair of dark running shorts, a small, rigid square clattered onto the laundry room tiles. I knelt and picked it up. It was a sleek, unmarked black plastic keycard. There was no hotel logo on the front, merely a magnetic strip on the back and a microscopic serial number etched into the bottom corner. I lifted the plastic card to my face. The faint, lingering scent of synthetic lavender hit my senses immediately. It was the exact same cheap perfume I had smelled on his collar the day I arrived. I slipped the card into my pocket and moved straight to the guest bedroom. I pulled the prepaid phone from beneath the mattress and took a clear, high-resolution photograph of the serial number. I sent the image to Fletcher with a single text, asking him to identify the issuer and cross-reference it with Trent's recent geographical movements. The reply came 20 minutes later. The card belonged to the Grand Crest, an upscale boutique hotel situated just outside the city limits. But Fletcher did not stop there. He operated with the same predatory thoroughness that I did. He bypassed the hotel's security protocols and pulled the billing ledger for the suite associated with that specific digital key. Trent had been maintaining a penthouse suite at the Grand Crest for the past 6 months. He was not paying for it with his own depleted funds. He was funding his illicit double life using a secondary platinum credit card issued entirely in my brother's name. Trent had intercepted the mail, activated the card, and quietly maxed out an $80,000 credit limit to entertain a 24-year-old cocktail waitress. Fletcher sent me 3 high-resolution surveillance stills captured by the hotel's lobby cameras. The images were undeniably clear. Trent holding the woman by the waist, buying her expensive champagne, laughing with the carefree arrogance of a man spending stolen money. I stared at the grainy photos on the small screen of the burner phone. My initial instinct was to hand the evidence directly to the police. Fraud, grand larceny, and elder abuse were already on the table. But the tactical reality of domestic abuse is infinitely more complicated. If the police arrested Trent today, Audrey would still be trapped in the psychological prison he had constructed. She had spent years apologizing for his violence, taking the blame for his failures, and twisting her own reality to survive his temper. If I simply removed him, she would spend the rest of her life believing she had somehow caused the destruction of her marriage. She needed to see the absolute truth of his betrayal with her own eyes. The illusion of her husband had to be shattered from the inside out. I instructed Fletcher to have a courier drop a hard copy of the photographs in a blank envelope behind the decorative stone planter at the edge of the driveway. At noon, while Trent was shouting at a debt collector on the back patio, I slipped out the front door and retrieved the package. I moved silently into the garage. Audrey's modest sedan was parked in the shadows. I opened the passenger door, popped the glove compartment, and wedged the glossy photographs directly between her vehicle registration and her insurance card. It was a place she checked every single time she went to the grocery store to retrieve her reusable shopping bags. I closed the door silently and retreated to my room to wait. The detonation occurred at 3:00. I heard the garage door open and close as Audrey returned from her errands. The heavy silence of the house was suddenly punctured by the sound of her rapid, uneven footsteps echoing across the kitchen floor. She did not come to the guest room to seek comfort. The years of conditioning ran too deep. She went directly to the source of her terror. I crept out of my room and stood perfectly still in the shadow of the hallway arch, leaning close to the cold drywall to listen. Trent was in the living room pouring his third drink of the afternoon. Audrey's voice trembled so violently it sounded like dry leaves snapping in the wind. She asked him who the woman in the pictures was. She asked him why there were hotel receipts in her father's name. The air in the house seemed to instantly freeze. I braced myself, waiting for the inevitable barrage of gaslighting and denial. I expected Trent to weave a complex lie or accuse Audrey of violating his privacy. He did not offer a single excuse. He did not bother to lie. The sound of glass shattering against the hardwood floor violently ripped through the house. Audrey let out a muffled, terrified gasp, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of a body being shoved hard against the drywall. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles turning white, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to force every muscle in my body to remain planted in the shadows, fighting the overwhelming urge to step around the corner and snap his neck. But premature intervention would ruin the federal trap closing around him. "You listen to me, you pathetic, ungrateful burden," Trent hissed, his voice dropping into a low, demonic register. "I am the only thing keeping you from living on the street. Your father is a senile liability, and you are nothing without me. You think I care about those pictures. You think anyone is going to believe a word you say. If you ever question me again, if you ever bring this up to anyone, I will put you in the hospital, and I will personally ensure your father stops breathing in his sleep. Do you understand me?" There was no defiance in Audrey's response. There was no anger. There was only the broken, whimpering sound of a woman completely surrendering to her captor. She apologized. She stood there crying, apologizing to the man who was bleeding her family dry and betraying her in the most humiliating way possible. She promised she would throw the pictures away and never speak of it again. Trent grunted in disgust and stormed out the front door, the heavy wood slamming shut with explosive force. I remained in the dark hallway, listening to my niece slide down the living room wall, weeping into her hands. The parameters of the game had fundamentally changed in that exact moment. I walked back to the guest room and sat on the edge of the mattress. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and stared at the blank screen. Saving my brother's physical house was no longer sufficient. Securing the frozen assets was no longer the primary objective. Trent Lawson had weaponized my brother's life to hold my niece hostage. He was not just a parasite, he was a lethal threat who operated with absolute impunity because he believed his victims were too broken to fight back. I realized that surviving this week was not enough. To truly free Audrey, to sever the psychological chains Trent had wrapped around her mind, I could not simply defeat him. I had to orchestrate an absolute liquidation of his entire existence. I had to tear down his finances, his freedom, and his tyrannical pride all at once, and I had to make sure Audrey was holding the match when the bridge finally burned. The trap was set for tomorrow afternoon. The corrupt notary was coming. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, calculated breath, readying myself for the slaughter. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the guest room, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood by the edge of the bed, preparing my physical form for the performance of a lifetime. I let my shoulders collapse inward, curving my spine to mimic the heavy, defeated posture of a man who had completely given up. I focused on my hands, forcing a slight rhythmic tremor into my fingers. I slowed my breathing until it sounded shallow and labored. I had spent decades studying the body language of guilty men, breaking under the pressure of an audit, but now I had to embody the absolute surrender of an innocent victim. I walked out of the room, dragging my feet across the hardwood floor, making sure every step sounded like a monumental effort. Trent was in the kitchen, leaning heavily against the marble island. He held a mug of black coffee, staring blankly out the window over the sink. The bags under his eyes were dark and heavy, a testament to the stress of his collapsing financial world. His knuckles were white, gripping the ceramic handle. I shuffled into the doorway, letting my slippers scrape against the tile. He snapped his head around, his eyes narrowing with immediate hostility. He looked at me as if I were a pest, a nuisance he was thoroughly exhausted by. "What do you want, old man?" he asked, his voice rough and laced with venom. I kept my gaze fixed on the floorboards, refusing to meet his eyes. I let my hands shake visibly by my sides, holding them up slightly, as if pleading for mercy. "I am tired, Trent," I whispered, forcing my voice to crack and waver. "I am so tired of fighting. I just want peace for Audrey and for myself." I paused, letting a heavy, ragged sigh escape my lungs. I told him I would do it. I told him I would sign the house over to him. The silence that followed was absolute. Trent set his coffee mug down on the island. He did not move for several seconds, processing my words. I could see the gears turning in his head, shifting from paranoid suspicion to overwhelming relief. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, his large frame looming over my hunched posture. He studied my face, looking for any trace of deception, any hint of a trap. But I gave him nothing. I only offered the hollow, broken expression of a father who had watched his daughter suffer and had finally broken under the weight of the abuse. "You are finally using your brain," Trent said, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "It is about time you realized how things work around here." He walked past me, intentionally bumping his shoulder hard against mine, forcing me to stumble back against the doorframe. He did not care about my surrender. He did not care about the emotional toll it took on my brother. He only cared about the victory. The cash was finally within his reach. He did not wait a single second. The urgency of his massive underground debts pushed him into immediate action. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number pacing the length of the kitchen. I stood quietly in the doorway, observing his every movement, mapping the careless arrogance of a man who believed he had just won the game. He put the phone to his ear, his posture completely transforming from a stressed gambler to a wealthy property owner. "Yeah, it is, Trent," he said, his voice booming with unearned confidence. The old man finally caved. "We are a go for the property transfer." I listened closely, dissecting the tone and the implications of the call. He was speaking to his shady developer contacts, the men waiting in the wings to purchase the house for a fraction of its value in untraceable cash. I needed them to finalize the transaction quickly. Trent demanded, pacing back toward the island. "I have the power of attorney ready, and the notary is on standby. I need the cash buyout ready by tomorrow afternoon." He listened to the voice on the other end, his smile widening into a greedy sneer. "Perfect," he replied. "No, we are not doing it at the bank. The bank requires too much oversight, too many questions from overly cautious managers." He paused, looking directly at me with cold, dead eyes. "We are going to do the signing off-site privately." I kept my head down, maintaining the illusion of a defeated man, but my heart hammered a slow, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. He was completely bypassing the standard legal escrow process. He was bringing in a corrupt notary and a dirty buyer to execute a fraudulent transfer of a major asset. It was the exact type of reckless, arrogant maneuver I had seen 100 white-collar criminals attempt right before I dismantled their entire lives. He was handing me the final pieces of evidence I needed to lock him in a federal prison. Trent ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He walked back to me, stopping just inches away. His massive frame blocked out the light from the kitchen window. "You are going to sign the papers tomorrow afternoon," he commanded. "But we are not doing it here, and we are not doing it at a lawyer's office. My contacts have a private workspace in the industrial park on the east side of town. It is quiet. No neighbors to snoop around and no bank tellers to ask stupid questions." I analyzed the logistical parameters of his demand instantly. The East Side Industrial Park was a sprawling labyrinth of abandoned warehouses and empty manufacturing plants. It was completely isolated. There would be no witnesses. Trent was not just planning a quiet real estate transaction. He was orchestrating a location where he had absolute physical control over the environment. I realized the profound danger of the situation in a fraction of a second. Once I signed that deed, he had no reason to bring me back to the house. He had already threatened to withhold my medication. He had already proven he was willing to let an old man die to solve his financial problems. He was setting up a kidnapping scenario. He planned to take me to an abandoned warehouse, strip me of my brother's single remaining asset, and leave me there. He would take the cash, flee the jurisdiction, and leave Audrey entirely destitute, while her father slowly died in a forgotten building. The sheer malevolence of his plan was breathtaking. It was a flawless strategy for a monster dealing with a genuinely helpless victim. "Do you understand me?" Trent demanded, grabbing the collar of my cardigan and jerking me forward. "We go to the warehouse, you sign the deed, and then maybe I let you have a quiet retirement somewhere far away from my wife." I let out a weak, pathetic whimper, nodding my head frantically. "I understand, Trent," I whispered, my voice shaking with perfectly manufactured terror. "Whatever you want. Just please let this be over." He released my collar, shoving me back slightly. "Be ready by 2:00 tomorrow," he sneered. "And do not even think about talking to Audrey about this. You say one word to her, and I swear you will not live to see the sunset." He turned his back on me, completely dismissing my existence as a threat. He walked back into the living room, whistling a low, cheerful tune, his mind already spending the money he believed he had secured. I turned and shuffled slowly down the hallway, returning to the guest bedroom. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, my posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished completely, replaced by a cold, lethal stillness. I walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet suburban street. Trent thought he had lured a sheep into a trap. He thought the isolation of the warehouse was his ultimate advantage. He did not understand that isolation works both ways. By moving the signing away from the house, he was removing Audrey from the immediate blast radius. By bypassing the legal banking system, he was removing any legitimate procedural hurdles that could slow down a federal raid. He was walking willingly into the exact environment I needed to execute a flawless, unmitigated takedown. The warehouse would be his tomb. I reached under the mattress and pulled out the burner phone. I composed a single encrypted text to Fletcher detailing the location change and the accelerated timeline. I instructed him to mobilize the Federal Asset Recovery Team and position them around the perimeter of the industrial park by noon tomorrow. They were to wait for absolute confirmation of the fraudulent transfer before breaching the doors. Trent was going to bring his dirty notary and his corrupt developers into a closed room. He was going to put the pen in my hand. He was going to give me everything I needed to destroy him. I sat back on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank screen of the phone. The false surrender was complete. The board was set. The final confrontation was only 24 hours away. I thought about the bruises on my brother's face. I thought about Audrey flinching in the dark corner of her own home. I buried the last remaining fragments of my own grief and allowed the calculating, ruthless machine inside me to take absolute control. Trent Lawson wanted a quiet place to finalize his theft. I was going to give him a quiet place to lose absolutely everything. The plastic trash bag crinkled in my trembling hands as I shuffled through the kitchen. I kept my shoulders slumped forward, playing the beaten old man to absolute perfection. Hidden deep inside the right pocket of my oversized corduroy trousers was a small, encrypted flash drive. It held the entirety of Trent's digital life. Every offshore betting ledger, every hidden shell company, every threatening email from underground lenders was neatly compressed into that tiny piece of plastic. I pushed the heavy back door open, stepping into the humid afternoon air. The alleyway behind the house was entirely empty, except for a faded delivery van idling near the corner. That was the courier. I had texted Fletcher the exact timing 10 minutes earlier. I dragged the heavy plastic bin toward the curb, letting my breathing sound ragged and weak. As I reached the edge of the pavement, a man in a gray uniform stepped out of the van holding a clipboard. He did not look at me. He simply walked past, dropping a cheap plastic pen on the concrete. I bent down with a painful, theatrical groan, slipping the flash drive into his open palm as I handed the pen back to him. "Keep up the good work," he muttered so quietly, the wind almost stole the words entirely. He turned and drove away. I stood alone by the trash bins, feeling a cold, profound satisfaction. During my decades hunting corrupt executives, I learned that the physical handover of evidence was always the most vulnerable point of any operation. It was the moment you were completely exposed. Men who hide stolen money are naturally paranoid, and Trent was no exception. But Trent had no idea he was dealing with a predator. He thought I was just a senile burden taking out the garbage. I returned to the guest room, pulling the door shut behind me. I retrieved the prepaid burner phone from beneath the mattress and sent a single encrypted symbol to Fletcher. His reply came seconds later, confirming he had the drive in his possession. He was already moving. Fletcher told me he was bypassing the local police departments entirely. He had pulled Trent's phone records that morning and found multiple outgoing calls to a local precinct captain. Trent was buying protection, ensuring that if a domestic disturbance was ever called in at this address, the responding officers would simply look the other way. He was a coward who paid for his immunity. But Fletcher was not a man who played by local rules. We had spent our entire careers circumventing compromised local authorities to bring down financial titans. He had spent his life building alliances in federal buildings, dismantling syndicates across state lines. He messaged me that a tactical asset recovery unit was already reviewing the files. They were preparing federal warrants for wire fraud, extortion, and elder abuse. They would be ready to swarm the industrial park the second Trent forced the pen into my hand. We had a definitive timeline. I typed a quick response telling Fletcher to hold his position until I gave the absolute final signal. I slid the phone back under the mattress, smoothing the heavy blankets over the top. The trap was perfectly primed. All I had to do was survive the next few hours without breaking my disguise. The heavy wooden door suddenly swung open, hitting the drywall with a violent, explosive crack. I jumped instinctively, curling my body inward to maintain the fragile illusion of my brother. Trent stood in the doorway, blocking out the light from the hallway. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and the sour smell of stale whiskey and stale sweat rolled off him in waves. He did not say a word. He simply raised his right hand. Dangling between his thick fingers was my prepaid burner phone. My chest tightened. I had pushed it far back under the mattress, but he must have torn the bed apart while I was in the kitchen taking out the trash. Trent stepped into the room, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He looked at the small plastic device and then looked down at me, his eyes dead and filled with absolute malice. "You thought you were clever," he whispered, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "You thought you could call for help." I let my jaw tremble, shrinking back against the headboard, pulling my knees to my chest. I whimpered, playing the role of a terrified captive, begging him to understand. I told him I just wanted to call Audrey because I was scared and confused. Trent laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the bare walls. He dropped the phone onto the hardwood floor. He raised his heavy boot and brought his heel down with crushing force. The plastic casing shattered instantly, spraying sharp fragments of black plastic across the room. He ground his heel into the electronic motherboard, utterly destroying the internal components until nothing was left but metal dust and broken glass. He leaned down, grabbing the collar of my sweater and hauling me up until my face was inches from his. "Nobody is coming to save you, old man," he hissed, spitting the words directly into my face. "You are entirely alone in this. Tomorrow afternoon, you are going to sign that house over to me, and then you are going to disappear. Do you understand me?" I let out a pathetic, broken sob, nodding my head frantically. He shoved me backward, letting me fall hard against the mattress. He turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The lock engaged with a heavy metallic thud. I sat in the dim light of the guest room, staring at the shattered remains of the phone on the floor. I was completely cut off. I had no way to communicate with Fletcher. I had no way to tell the federal agents when to breach the warehouse doors. If I signed the papers and the authorities did not move fast enough, Trent would take the documents and vanish, leaving me stranded and Audrey completely destitute. I reached down and picked up a broken piece of the plastic casing, turning it over in my palm. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. Trent thought he had destroyed my lifeline. He thought he had severed my connection to the outside world, ensuring his absolute victory. He assumed that cutting off communication would paralyze me. But he did not understand how men like Fletcher Reed operated. We had spent decades communicating across hostile corporate environments, where every email was monitored and every phone line was tapped. We had long ago established protocols for dead air. Fletcher knew the timeline. He knew the meeting was tomorrow afternoon. He knew I was supposed to check in every 4 hours to confirm my status. The sudden, unexplainable silence from my end would not be interpreted as a surrender. It would be interpreted as a critical escalation. Trent believed the destruction of the phone meant nobody was coming. He was wrong. The silence was the signal. By taking away my voice, he had just pulled the trigger on his own execution. I settled back against the pillows, closing my eyes and slowing my heart rate. I did not need a phone anymore. I just needed to walk into that warehouse tomorrow and let the silence bring down the hammer. The digital clock on the microwave read 10 in the morning. 4 hours remained until the execution of Trent's final play. The house vibrated with a sickening, nervous energy. Trent was upstairs, pacing heavily across the master bedroom floor, barking rapid instructions into his cell phone to the corrupt notary. Audrey was in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing a cast iron pan in the sink. Her shoulders were drawn tight to her ears. The photograph of the hotel mistress I had planted in her car sat like a radioactive isotope in her mind. She was fracturing, but she had not yet shattered. She needed a final, precise strike to break the conditioning of her abuser. I shuffled into the kitchen, dragging my feet against the tile, playing the pathetic ghost of my brother. I waited until Trent's heavy footsteps moved into the master bathroom and the shower water turned on. The rushing water provided a temporary acoustic shield. I abandoned the shuffling gait. I walked up right behind Audrey, moving with absolute silence. I reached out and firmly turned off the kitchen faucet. The sudden absence of running water was deafening. She flinched violently, spinning around with her hands dripping wet, gripping the sponge like a weapon. She opened her mouth to ask what I needed to tell me to go back to my room, but the words died in her throat. I did not give her the frail, trembling version of the man she had been watching for days. I straightened my spine, rising to my full height. The pathetic stoop in my shoulders vanished instantly. I locked my gaze onto hers with cold, predatory authority. I spoke, my voice dropping into the deep, resonant baritone she had not heard in almost a decade. "Stop scrubbing, Audrey. The pan is clean. Anne is—" She froze, completely paralyzed. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of wet ash. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying cognitive dissonance. She was looking at the exact face of her father, but she was hearing the voice of the uncle who used to dismantle corporate lawyers at the Thanksgiving dinner table. I stepped closer, backing her against the granite counter. "You are not my father," she whispered, the words barely escaping her trembling lips. "I am Nolan," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and absolute. "Miles is safe. He is resting in my secure room at the psychiatric facility under a false name where your husband cannot reach him." She shook her head, trying to reject the reality standing right in front of her. She stammered, asking what I was talking about and why I was wearing his clothes. She tried to look past me toward the hallway, as if expecting the real Miles to suddenly appear. I did not let her retreat into her comfortable denial. I stepped directly into her personal space, forcing her to look into my eyes. I told her that 2 days ago, Miles walked into my care facility wearing aviator sunglasses to hide the fact that his orbital bone was shattered and his lip was split wide open. I described the bruising pattern in clinical, agonizing detail, explaining exactly how Trent had driven a closed fist into the side of a 73-year-old man's face simply because Miles hesitated to sign away the family home. Audrey let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She brought her wet hands up to cover her mouth, tears instantly spilling over her lower lashes. She tried to turn away to hide her face, but I grabbed her shoulders, holding her firmly in place. I told her she could not look away anymore. I told her the era of staring at the floorboards while her husband destroyed her family was officially over. I asked her if she honestly thought Trent was just stressed from his investments. I did not raise my voice, but every word was a calculated hammer blow. I told her about the offshore sports betting ledgers I had pulled from his locked laptop in the middle of the night. I told her about the hundreds of thousands of dollars he currently owed to men who use crowbars to collect their debts. I pushed relentlessly, pulling away every layer of rationalization she had built to survive her marriage. I reminded her of the photographs she found hidden in her glove box yesterday afternoon. I watched the profound shame wash over her features. I told her Trent had intercepted a credit card in her father's name and maxed out an $80,000 limit to fund a penthouse suite at the Grand Crest for a 24-year-old cocktail waitress. While she was washing his dishes and tiptoeing around his temper, he was bleeding her family dry to fund a second life. And today, I whispered, leaning in so close she could not escape the words, today he plans to force me to sign away this house at an abandoned warehouse so he can liquidate the property and flee the country, leaving you and Miles with absolutely nothing. Audrey was openly weeping now, her chest heaving with silent, devastating sobs. All the lies she had told herself to survive the last 5 years were crumbling into dust right in front of her. I told her she had to make a choice right now. She could either remain the compliant, battered victim and let him destroy her father, or she could stand up, look me in the eye, and help me burn Trent Lawson to the ground. The heavy thud of the bathroom door upstairs slamming shut echoed through the ceiling. The shower had stopped. Heavy, uneven footsteps pounded down the carpeted stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Trent was moving fast. He rounded the corner into the kitchen, his face flushed from the hot water and his eyes darting frantically. He stopped dead in his tracks, seeing us standing close together. I instantly dropped my shoulders, letting my spine curve back into the familiar defeated slump. I let my hands begin to shake violently. I stared vacantly at the floor tiles, letting my mouth hang slightly open, reverting to the broken shell of Miles Becker. Trent glared at Audrey, his chest heaving with immediate suspicion. He demanded to know what was going on in here and why she was crying. He stepped aggressively into the kitchen, his massive frame dominating the small space. He looked at my trembling hands and then back to Audrey, his eyes narrowing with a dark, lethal paranoia. "I warned you about talking to him," he hissed, stepping closer to his wife. "What did he say to you? Tell me right now before I lose my temper." Audrey stood frozen against the kitchen counter. Her eyes darted from Trent's furious, flushed face to my trembling, stooped figure. I could see the sheer panic vibrating through her entire body. She was standing on the absolute edge of a precipice. All she had to do was tell the truth. All she had to do was point at me and tell Trent that I was not her father, but a forensic accountant who had just mapped out his entire criminal existence. If she spoke my name, the entire federal trap would instantly evaporate, and Trent would exact a terrible physical vengeance on us both right there in the kitchen. The silence stretched tight as a piano wire. Trent raised his hand, stepping directly into her personal space, his body language radiating the promise of immediate violence. I said, "What is he talking to you about?" Trent barked, his voice echoing off the tile. Audrey took a slow, ragged breath. She wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand and stood up straight. She looked Trent dead in the eye. The hollow, terrified gaze of the compliant victim vanished completely. Nothing she said, her voice completely steady and utterly devoid of fear. "He is just rambling about the past again. He thought I was my mother. He is confused, Trent. He does not know where he is or what day it is." Trent stared at her for a long, heavy second, searching her face for the lie. He looked down at me, scoffing in absolute disgust. He told Audrey to get me a glass of water and keep me completely quiet until the car arrived. He told her if I made one more sound, he would lock me in the basement until the notary got here. He turned his back on her, entirely dismissing us both as irrelevant, broken things, and stormed back out of the kitchen toward his home office. Audrey waited until his heavy footsteps faded completely down the hallway. She did not look at the floorboards anymore. She turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were hard and bright, with a cold, unfamiliar fury. She gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. The psychological chains had been completely severed. The alliance was permanently forged. We were going to destroy him. The clock struck 2 in the afternoon, and Trent did not waste a single second. He stormed into the guest bedroom and grabbed me by the upper arm, his thick fingers digging painfully into my bicep. He hauled me off the mattress, ignoring my feigned cries of confusion and physical pain. He dragged me down the hallway and shoved me out the front door without letting me grab a jacket. The afternoon sun was blinding, but I kept my head bowed, letting my chin rest against my chest. Audrey stood near the kitchen archway, watching us leave. Her face was a mask of perfectly calibrated terror, but I saw the hard glint of absolute resolve in her eyes. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew the trap was set, and she was ready for the fallout. Trent pushed me aggressively toward the heavy black SUV parked in the driveway. He opened the rear passenger door and threw me inside like a sack of garbage. I tumbled onto the premium leather seats, letting my limbs flail awkwardly to maintain the illusion of complete physical weakness. Trent slammed the door shut, shaking the entire chassis of the massive vehicle. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The powerful motor roared to life. He did not bother to look at me in the rearview mirror. He threw the vehicle into gear and sped out of the quiet suburban neighborhood, taking the corner so fast the tires squealed against the pavement. I huddled in the back seat, pulling my knees up and wrapping my arms tightly around my chest. I let my hands tremble violently, resting them against my knees. The air conditioning blasted freezing air through the vents, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was completely suffocating. Trent was vibrating with a manic, toxic energy. He was tapping his thumbs against the leather steering wheel, keeping a rapid, erratic rhythm. He believed he was crossing the final finish line. He believed he had successfully outsmarted a helpless old man and secured the massive capital he desperately needed to save his own life from underground lenders. We drove in absolute silence for the first 20 minutes. The manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks of the wealthy suburbs slowly gave way to the decaying infrastructure of the city limits. Pristine strip malls faded into empty lots surrounded by rusted chain-link fences. The roads became uneven and cracked, making the heavy vehicle bounce and shudder violently. Trent finally broke the heavy silence. His voice was dripping with a sick, triumphant joy. "You really made this difficult, old man," he said, not bothering to turn his head. "You fought me every step of the way, but look exactly where it got you. You are in the back of my car, and you are going to give me exactly what I want." I let out a low, pathetic whimper, pressing my face against the cold leather seat. "Please, Trent," I whispered, letting my voice break and shatter. "Just take the house and leave Audrey alone. Just let us live in peace." Trent threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming sound that filled the car with absolute malice and arrogance. "Peace," he mocked, shaking his head side to side. "You think you are getting peace after everything you put me through. You think I am just going to let you go back to that beautiful house and sit in your comfortable recliner while I fix my financial problems." He gripped the steering wheel so tight, his thick knuckles turned completely white. "You really are senile, Miles." He began to outline his exit strategy, and the sheer cruelty of his plan was breathtaking. He told me that once the papers were signed and the corrupt notary stamped the final deed, he was taking the cash payout directly to his offshore contacts. But he was not taking me back to the safety of the suburbs. He told me he had found a derelict state-run psychiatric facility 3 counties over near the border. It was an underfunded, overflowing nightmare of a hospital where unwanted elders were abandoned and forgotten by the system. He said he was going to drive me to the emergency room, drop me on the pavement, without a wallet, without identification, and without my essential heart medication. He said he would drive away before the triage nurses even found me shivering in the dark. "By the time they figure out who you are, your fragile heart will have already given out." He explained, his voice perfectly calm, as he casually detailed my murder. And even if you survive long enough to talk, nobody is going to believe a rambling old man with no identification and a history of dementia. They will just strap you to a hospital bed and drug you until you stop making noise. He told me he was going to tell Audrey that her father had wandered off into the woods behind the neighborhood during a severe manic episode. He said he would pretend to search for me for a few days to keep up appearances, and then he would take the money and catch a flight to South America, leaving Audrey entirely alone with no house, no money, and no father. He was systematically erasing our entire family to cover his gambling debts. He was a parasite who had decided to kill the host just to feed himself one last time. I kept my face buried in my arms, letting my shoulders heave as if I were weeping uncontrollably in the back seat. But behind my hidden face, my expression was entirely stone. My heart beat with a slow, measured, tactical rhythm. Every word he spoke sealed his fate in heavy cement. He was giving me the moral and absolute authorization to destroy him completely. He thought he was explaining his brilliant victory, but he was actually reading his own obituary. The heavy SUV turned sharply off the main road, passing through a pair of rusted iron security gates. The expensive tires crunched loudly over broken glass and loose gravel. We had arrived at the industrial park. It was a sprawling graveyard of abandoned manufacturing plants and collapsing logistics warehouses. The buildings were massive structures of corrugated metal and shattered cinder block. Nature had begun to reclaim the area with thick green weeds pushing forcefully through the cracked asphalt. There were no other cars on the road. There were no pedestrians. There were no security cameras monitoring the perimeter. It was a perfectly isolated, desolate wasteland. Trent navigated the complex labyrinth of decaying buildings, pulling up to a massive warehouse at the very back of the property. The massive windows were completely boarded up with rotting plywood. He parked the vehicle and killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy and oppressive, pressing against my ears. He unbuckled his seatbelt and turned his massive body around to face me. "Do not make a single sound," he ordered, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "You walk in, you sign the legal papers where they tell you to sign, and you keep your mouth completely shut. If you try to ask for help from anyone inside, I will break your jaw before you can finish the sentence." I nodded frantically, wiping imaginary tears from my wrinkled eyes. He got out of the car and opened my door, grabbing me by the thick sweater and hauling me roughly onto the broken pavement. The afternoon heat was sweltering, but the air felt dead and stagnant. He pushed me hard toward a small, heavy steel door set into the side of the massive metal building. He pulled it open and shoved me forcefully inside. The interior of the warehouse was a cavernous expanse of empty shadows and thick concrete dust. The air smelled strongly of damp mildew and old motor oil. In the center of the massive room, beneath a single flickering fluorescent bulb hung from a frayed black wire, was a cheap folding table. 4 metal folding chairs were arranged neatly around it. 3 men were already waiting for us. I kept my knees bent and my head low, instantly analyzing the hostiles in the room. The man sitting at the table was thin and extremely nervous. He wore a cheap, wrinkled gray suit and had a sheen of greasy sweat across his pale forehead. He had a leather briefcase open in front of him and several heavy ink stamps lined up next to a thick stack of legal documents. This was the corrupt notary, the man willing to bypass federal real estate law for a quick cash payout. But the other 2 men were the real tactical problem. They stood directly behind the notary with their arms crossed over their massive chests. They were absolutely not real estate developers. They were cartel muscle. They wore tight, dark clothing that barely concealed the thick slabs of heavy muscle on their arms and broad shoulders. One of them had a dark, jagged tattoo creeping up the side of his thick neck. The other had a flattened nose indicating a long history of brutal physical violence. They stared at me with cold, dead eyes, sizing me up like a piece of meat ready for the slaughterhouse floor. I was completely isolated. The heavy steel door closed loudly behind me, cutting off the outside world. I was standing in an abandoned building, outnumbered 4-to-1 by men who had no moral objection to extreme violence. I did not have my burner phone. I could not send a final signal to Fletcher. I had to rely entirely on his ability to track the sudden silence and coordinate the Federal tactical breach at the exact right moment. Trent pushed me aggressively forward, forcing me to stumble toward the folding table. "Look what I brought you, gentlemen," Trent announced, his voice echoing loudly across the empty concrete walls. He pulled out a metal chair and shoved me down into it. I collapsed heavily into the seat, letting my hands shake visibly on my lap. The notary looked at me and then looked away nervously, adjusting his thin glasses. The two massive enforcers did not move a single muscle. "Get the papers ready," Trent commanded, slamming his heavy hand down on the folding table, causing the stamps to rattle. "The old man is ready to cooperate today. He just wants to sign his life away so he can go take a nice long nap." The notary hastily pushed a thick stack of real estate transfer documents across the table toward me. He uncapped an expensive black pen and placed it directly next to the signature line. "Sign exactly where the yellow tabs are," he said, his voice squeaking slightly in the massive quiet room. I stared down at the documents. It was a complete unconditional transfer of the deed and the immediate liquidation of the property into a blind trust controlled entirely by Trent. It was the absolute destruction of my brother's entire legacy. I slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the black pen. I let the tip hover just above the white paper, playing the terrified, broken victim perfectly. The trap was fully loaded. I just needed to stall for a few more seconds to let the federal hammer fall. The air inside the abandoned warehouse was thick with concrete dust and the suffocating smell of stale motor oil. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed erratically overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty, cavernous room. In the center of the cracked floor sat a cheap metal folding table. Trent shoved me roughly toward one of the rusted metal chairs. I collapsed into the seat, letting my shoulders slump forward, playing the role of the defeated elderly victim to absolute perfection. I kept my head bowed, staring at the scuffed tips of my shoes, while my hands trembled violently in my lap. The corrupt notary sat directly across the table from me. He was a thin, nervous man, wearing a cheap gray suit that clung to his sweating frame. He constantly wiped his pale forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. He had his heavy leather briefcase open, displaying the fraudulent transfer deeds and his official state seals. Near the heavy steel exit doors stood two massive enforcers. They wore dark tactical clothing and kept their arms crossed over their thick chests. They were cartel muscle hired by the corrupt developers to ensure the transaction went smoothly. They stared at me with cold, dead eyes, completely indifferent to the extortion happening right in front of them. Trent marched up behind my chair, his massive presence blocking out the meager overhead light. He slammed his heavy hand down onto the metal table, making the notary flinch and the ink stamps rattle. "Get the papers ready," Trent commanded, his voice booming with arrogant authority. He reached down and grabbed my right wrist forcibly, prying my trembling fingers open. He shoved a thick black plastic pen into my palm. "Sign it, old man," Trent hissed, leaning so close I could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "Sign the deed right now, and maybe I let you walk out of here alive." I looked down at the heavy black pen resting in my hand. I stared at the crisp white pages of the fraudulent real estate documents. Trent believed he had won. He believed he had completely broken me and isolated me beyond the reach of any rescue. He had no idea he had just walked into the exact center of my trap. I let my fingers shake for one final agonizing second, and then I stopped. The violent tremor in my hands vanished completely. A cold, absolute stillness washed over my entire body. I slowly placed the black pen down on the metal table, aligning it perfectly parallel to the stack of illegal documents. I uncurled my spine, rolling my shoulders back and sitting up straight. The pathetic, stooped posture of the terrified father-in-law evaporated into the stagnant air. I drew in a slow, deep breath, expanding my chest and rising to my full physical height. I lifted my chin and locked my eyes directly onto the sweating notary. I did not look at Trent. I focused the entirety of my predatory attention on the man in the gray suit. Arthur Pendleton. I said, my voice ringing across the empty warehouse in a deep, commanding baritone that completely shattered the illusion of my frailty. State Notary License Number 472901. Residing at 422 Maplewood Drive. The notary froze, completely paralyzed. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound escaped his throat. He stared at me in absolute terror, unable to comprehend how a senile old man knew his personal home address. I leaned forward, resting both my hands flat and steady against the metal table. You are currently facilitating a fraudulent transfer of assets under extreme duress. I continued, my tone devoid of any emotion, perfectly calm and lethal. That is a direct violation of Federal Penal Code Section 1028 concerning wire fraud and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. If you apply your official stamp to that document, Arthur, you will be facing a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I will personally ensure your bank accounts are frozen and your pension is liquidated before you even reach the police precinct. The notary scrambled backward, his metal chair scraping violently against the concrete floor. He threw his hands up in the air, shaking his head frantically. He bumped into the wall behind him, desperately trying to distance himself from the table and the fraudulent documents. Trent stood completely paralyzed behind me. His brain was violently misfiring, trying to process the impossible physical and vocal transformation happening right in front of him. He stared at my steady hands, my upright posture, and the cold, lethal authority radiating from my every word. He looked at the side of my face and realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that he was not looking at the frail, broken man he had beaten in the living room days ago. "You are not Miles Trent," whispered the realization, hitting him like a physical blow. His face twisted into a mask of pure, uncontrollable rage as the cognitive dissonance broke his mind. His absolute control over the situation had just been shattered, and his immediate instinct was extreme, violent retaliation. "You are a dead man," Trent roared. He lunged around the side of the table, throwing his massive body forward. He aimed a wild, brutal haymaker directly at the side of my head, intending to knock me unconscious. He expected me to cower. He expected me to freeze in terror, just like his wife always did. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent my early career training with Federal Tactical Asset Recovery Units before I ever touched a financial ledger. I did not retreat. I simply stepped smoothly to the left, dropping my center of gravity and letting his massive forward momentum carry him past me. As his heavy arm swung violently through the empty space where my head had been, I pivoted my hips. I drove my right foot sharply and precisely into the back of his knee joint. The joint buckled instantly under his own weight. Trent let out a sharp cry of shock as his balance completely collapsed. Before his body could hit the floor, I grabbed the back of his heavy leather jacket and the thick collar of his shirt. I used his own violent downward momentum against him, driving his face and chest brutally into the unforgiving concrete floor. The impact echoed through the cavernous warehouse with a sickening, heavy crunch. The air left his lungs in a harsh, ragged gasp. I dropped down and planted my knee firmly, squarely between his shoulder blades, pinning his massive frame entirely to the ground. I grabbed his right arm and twisted it up behind his back, pulling the joint just past the point of agonizing resistance. Trent groaned loudly, spitting blood and concrete dust from his mouth, but he was completely immobilized. The two cartel enforcers by the steel doors finally reacted to the sudden explosion of violence. They dropped their arms and reached aggressively beneath their dark jackets, stepping away from the wall. I did not flinch. I kept my knee driving heavily into Trent's spine and looked directly at the two massive men. "I would not do that," I said, my voice echoing calmly and clearly across the room. "There are 12 federal tactical agents currently surrounding this building, holding rifles aimed directly at those corrugated metal doors. They are waiting for my exact signal to breach. If you pull a weapon right now, you will not leave this industrial park breathing." The two men froze, exchanging a rapid, uncertain glance. They were hired muscle, not martyrs. They looked at the terrified notary cowering in the corner, and then down at Trent groaning in agony beneath my knee. They slowly raised their empty hands, stepping backward away from the heavy steel doors. The fight was completely over. Trent struggled weakly beneath my knee, gasping for air. "Who are you?" he choked out, his voice ragged and wet with blood. I leaned down, bringing my mouth close to his ear. "I am the man who is going to take back everything you stole," I whispered. The silence of the warehouse was suddenly shattered by the deafening screech of heavy armored vehicles skidding to a halt outside the metal doors. The federal hammer had finally arrived. The concrete floor of the abandoned warehouse was covered in a thick layer of industrial dust and crushed gravel. Trent was pinned entirely beneath the weight of my knee. His massive chest heaved violently against the unforgiving stone as he desperately tried to draw air into his crushed lungs. I kept my posture absolutely rigid, locking my joints to ensure my body weight acted as an immovable anchor. He squirmed beneath me, letting out a wet, gurgling groan. The heavy silence of the cavernous room amplified the sound of his complete physical defeat. The two men standing near the exit doors did not move a single muscle. They remained completely frozen, watching a man they believed to be a frail septuagenarian dismantle a muscular predator in less than 3 seconds. The terrified notary was still cowering in the corner, pressing his thin back against the rusted corrugated metal siding. He was clutching his leather briefcase to his chest, as if the thin material could somehow shield him from the violent reality unfolding in the center of the room. Trent turned his face to the side, scraping his cheek against the dirt. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the confusion and the pain from his vision. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The pathetic, shuffling old man he had abused for days was completely gone. I stared down at him with an expression devoid of any human empathy. "You asked me who I was," I said, my voice echoing across the empty space in a deep, commanding baritone. The hollow rasp of your father-in-law was completely erased from my throat. "I told you I am the man who is going to take back everything you stole." Trent let out a choked, ragged breath, trying to process the impossible truth standing directly over him. He shook his head slowly, smearing a thick mixture of blood and dust across his jaw. "You are not Miles," he whispered, the words tearing painfully from his bruised throat. I pressed my knee slightly deeper into his spine, applying a calculated measure of agonizing pressure. "You are incredibly observant, Trent," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and absolute. "Miles could not be here today. He is currently resting in a highly secure private medical facility far beyond your physical reach. He is safe, and he is finally healing from the brutal injuries you inflicted upon him." I paused, letting the absolute finality of the situation sink into his fractured mind. I watched his eyes dart wildly around the empty space, searching for an escape that did not exist. I told him I was his younger brother. I told him my name was Nolan. I leaned down slightly, ensuring every single syllable penetrated the chaotic panic echoing inside his skull. "And I am his accountant," I stated. The revelation hit Trent like a secondary physical blow. The absolute arrogant certainty that had guided his every action for the past week completely evaporated. He realized in one devastating instant that his entire campaign of psychological terror had been a carefully monitored experiment. He had not trapped a vulnerable old man in a cage. He had invited a federal forensic auditor directly into his home and handed him the keys to his entire criminal empire. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a low, guttural sound of pure, defeated despair. He knew his life as a free man was entirely over. He had walked willingly into his own slaughterhouse. The two massive enforcers standing near the heavy steel doors finally broke from their paralyzed state. They were hired muscle paid to intimidate a helpless victim during a quiet, illegal real estate transaction. They were not paid to engage in a federal sting operation orchestrated by a phantom accountant. The man with the flattened nose exchanged a rapid, panicked glance with his heavily tattooed partner. The illusion of a quick cash payout had completely disintegrated. They recognized the lethal efficiency in the way I had neutralized Trent, and they clearly understood the dire legal implications of my words. There was no money to be made here today. There was only the immediate threat of a massive federal prison sentence. The tattooed man muttered a harsh command in a low, rough voice. They abandoned their positions near the folding table immediately. They turned their broad backs on Trent, completely discarding the man who had hired them. They moved with a desperate, frantic energy boots, thudding heavily against the cracked concrete floor. They rushed toward the massive corrugated sliding doors at the front of the warehouse, hoping to slip away into the desolate industrial park before the authorities arrived. The terrified notary saw them retreating and let out a high-pitched, panicked squeak. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase, letting the fraudulent property deeds and the illegal ink stamps scatter across the dirty floor. He scrambled blindly after the two enforcers, desperate to escape the inevitable consequences of his corruption. He stumbled over a piece of broken rebar, scraping his knees against the rough ground, but he did not stop moving. The warehouse was descending into absolute chaos as the rats attempted to flee the sinking ship. The tattooed enforcer reached the heavy iron chains hanging from the main warehouse doors. He grabbed the rusted metal, pulling downward with all of his massive physical strength. The heavy steel rollers shrieked violently against the unlubricated tracks, protesting the sudden movement. The massive doors began to part, sliding open, to reveal the sweltering afternoon air outside. The two enforcers prepared to sprint into the empty gravel lot, but their escape route was instantly eradicated. The moment the doors separated, a blinding wall of pure white light violently pierced the dim interior of the warehouse. The sheer intensity of the illumination completely washed out the daylight, forcing the fleeing men to throw their arms up to shield their eyes. The deafening roar of high-performance engines echoed off the metal siding of the building. 3 massive black Federal sport utility vehicles had completely barricaded the loading dock. They were parked in a tight, aggressive tactical formation, perfectly sealing the only exit. The heavy tires crunched against the gravel as the vehicles lurched to a final synchronized halt. The harsh halogen floodlights mounted to their reinforced grills cut through the swirling concrete dust, casting long, imposing shadows across the warehouse floor. The massive engines idled with a deep, menacing rumble that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The trap had snapped entirely shut. There was nowhere left to run. The doors of the black vehicles swung open simultaneously with military precision. A dozen Federal agents poured out into the desolate lot, clad in heavy, dark tactical gear. They moved with absolute silent efficiency, fanning out to secure the perimeter and sealing every possible avenue of retreat. The 2 cartel enforcers froze, completely trapped in the blinding glare of the halogen lights. They slowly raised their empty hands, interlacing their thick fingers behind their heads in a gesture of absolute surrender. They dropped slowly to their knees, acknowledging their complete tactical defeat. The terrified notary simply collapsed onto his stomach in the dirt, weeping openly as the tactical team advanced. Agents swarmed over them, securing plastic restraints around their wrists and hauling them roughly to their feet. From the center vehicle, a single figure emerged, moving with a calm, measured authority that commanded the entire chaotic scene. Fletcher Reed stepped out of the heavy black vehicle, shutting the armored door firmly behind him. He wore a pristine dark suit that contrasted sharply with the decaying industrial wasteland surrounding him. His silver hair caught the harsh light as he surveyed the captured men with a cold, calculating gaze. He held a sleek silver briefcase securely in his right hand. The briefcase contained the comprehensive digital warrants, the frozen bank ledgers, and the absolute authorization to completely liquidate Trent Lawson's entire existence. Fletcher walked slowly up the concrete loading ramp, stepping past the kneeling notary and the surrendering enforcers. He entered the dusty warehouse, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked floor. He looked across the vast, empty space until his eyes found me kneeling over the broken body of Trent Lawson. Fletcher stopped near the scattered real estate documents and offered a slow, deliberate nod of professional approval. He looked down at the ruined man pinned beneath my knee. Trent was staring up at the Federal agents, tears of pure panic carving clean tracks through the dust on his face. The illusion of his power was completely shattered. He was nothing but a broken coward facing a lifetime in a concrete cell. You cut it incredibly close, Nolan Fletcher said, his voice projecting clearly across the room. I assume the drive you provided was accurate and comprehensive. I kept my knee firmly planted in Trent's back, keeping the pressure absolute. Every single offshore account is meticulously mapped and verified. I replied, my voice completely steady. You will find enough wire fraud to bury him for decades. Fletcher nodded slowly, tapping the silver briefcase against his leg. The agents moved into the warehouse surrounding the folding table and securing the remaining fraudulent documents. 2 men approached me, ready to take custody of the prisoner. I slowly stood up, releasing the pressure from Trent's spine. He gasped greedily for air, remaining perfectly still on the ground as the agents clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his bruised wrists. I stepped away from the table, watching them drag Trent to his feet. He could not look at me. His arrogance had been utterly decimated by the quiet, relentless patience of a man he had completely underestimated. He was hauled away toward the waiting vehicles, his heavy boots dragging pathetically across the gravel. Fletcher walked up to me, resting a hand on my shoulder. You executed a flawless operation, he murmured, staring out at the flashing lights. Miles and Audrey are entirely safe. The long shadow of Trent Lawson had been permanently erased from my family. The silent reckoning was finally complete. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents slammed against the concrete floor, kicking up thick clouds of gray dust. The deafening screech of the armored vehicles outside faded into a low, predatory rumble. The massive space was completely saturated with the flashing red and blue lights of the federal convoy. The illumination bounced violently off the rusted corrugated metal walls, casting erratic shadows across the room. Trent struggled wildly against the heavy hands pressing him down. 2 federal agents gripped his shoulders, forcing his face hard against the cheap metal folding table. The cold steel of the heavy handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his thick wrists, locking him into absolute submission. He gasped for air, his chest heaving against the table as the adrenaline and pure terror flooded his system. The corrupt notary was already being dragged toward the exit by 2 agents, his expensive leather shoes sliding pathetically across the gravel. He was weeping openly, begging for a plea deal, before he even reached the transport vehicles. The 2 cartel enforcers were marched out right behind him, their massive heads bowed in silent defeat. The warehouse was systematically cleared of all hostile elements, leaving only Trent pinned to the table in the center of the room. Fletcher Reed approached the table, moving with the calm, deliberate grace of an apex predator. He set his sleek silver briefcase down on the metal surface right next to Trent's bleeding face. The locks unlatched with 2 sharp metallic clicks that echoed loudly in the quiet space. Fletcher lifted the lid, revealing a thick stack of pristine legal documents. He reached inside and pulled out a sheaf of papers printed on heavy official stock. He laid the first document directly under Trent's eyes. Trent blinked rapidly, trying to focus his vision on the crisp black text. Fletcher spoke, his voice projecting a cold, absolute authority. He told Trent he was looking at a federal asset freeze mandate authorized by a district judge less than an hour ago. Fletcher explained that his tactical accounting team had spent the last 48 hours dismantling every single layer of Trent's digital infrastructure. They had located the offshore shell companies he used to hide his embezzled funds. They had traced the encrypted wire transfers he sent to illegal sports betting syndicates. They had seized the secondary credit accounts he opened under my brother's name. Fletcher placed a second document on the table. He told Trent that every penny he had stolen, every single dollar he had hidden in dummy accounts, had been entirely confiscated by the federal government. His personal bank accounts were completely zeroed out. His investment portfolios were fully liquidated to pay back the victims of his fraud. He was absolutely unequivocally bankrupt. He did not have enough money left to buy a cup of coffee, let alone afford a high-powered defense attorney. Trent writhed against the table, his face contorted in a mask of pure disbelief. He spat blood onto the documents, screaming that this was impossible. He yelled that he had covered his tracks perfectly. He thrashed his heavy legs against the floor, trying to break free from the agents holding him down. He glared at me, standing quietly on the other side of the table. He roared that I was nothing but a senile old man, a pathetic burden who belonged in a state facility. He screamed that I could not have possibly orchestrated this trap. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate insults wash over me. I did not bother to explain the intricate mechanics of forensic accounting to a man who was already a ghost. I simply stared at him with cold, empty eyes, watching the realization slowly crush his spirit. He finally understood that he had invited his own executioner into his home. He had handed me the exact tools I needed to destroy his life. The sheer arrogant stupidity of his actions finally penetrated his thick skull. The panic completely overtook him. His financial leverage was gone. His physical intimidation was entirely useless. He resorted to his final desperate weapon. He screamed for his wife. He yelled Audrey's name at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing frantically off the high metal ceiling. He demanded that she come inside. He ordered her to call his legal team and fix this catastrophic mistake. He still believed he owned her. He still believed the years of systematic emotional abuse had permanently chained her to his side. He thought she would run to his rescue out of pure conditioned terror. The heavy armored door of the lead federal vehicle parked outside swung open. Audrey stepped out into the sweltering afternoon air. She did not rush. She did not tremble. She walked slowly up the concrete loading ramp, her shoes clicking steadily against the pavement. The federal agents parted silently to let her through. She walked into the dim light of the warehouse, moving with a grace and absolute certainty I had not seen in her since she was a young woman. Her shoulders were pulled back, and her head was held high. The timid, broken girl who used to apologize to the floorboards had been completely eradicated. Trent strained his neck to look at her as she approached the table. His face lit up with a sickening, manipulative hope. He begged her to tell the agents that this was all a terrible mistake. He ordered her to get his phone and call his broker. He used the exact same sharp, demanding tone he used to terrify her in the kitchen just hours ago. He expected her to shrink backward. He expected her to start crying and apologizing. Audrey stopped 3 feet away from the metal table. She looked down at the man who had turned her life into a suffocating nightmare. She did not flinch. She did not shed a single tear. She stared at him with eyes made of pure, absolute ice. She looked at his bleeding face, his handcuffed wrists, and his desperate, pathetic expression. She saw him for exactly what he was. He was not a powerful titan of industry. He was a weak, cowardly parasite who had finally been crushed under the weight of his own greed. She reached across to her left hand. She slowly took hold of the heavy diamond wedding ring on her finger. Trent stopped speaking, his mouth hanging open in complete shock. Audrey pulled the ring over her knuckle, severing the final physical symbol of their toxic marriage. She held the glittering diamond out over a dark, oily puddle of stagnant water gathered in a depression on the cracked concrete floor. She looked Trent directly in the eyes. She told him he would never see her again. She told him he would never set foot in her father's house again. She opened her fingers. The heavy gold ring dropped through the damp air. It hit the dirty water with a dull, hollow splash, sinking instantly out of sight into the toxic black mud. Audrey did not look down. She simply turned her back on him and walked away. She walked back out into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving the warehouse without a single backward glance. Trent completely shattered. The final thread of his control snapped, snapping his mind along with it. He let out a raw, guttural scream of pure, agonizing defeat. He thrashed violently against the table, completely losing his mind. He cursed the federal agents, he cursed Fletcher, and he cursed me. He kicked his heavy boots against the metal table legs, causing the entire structure to shake. "Oh, son." Fletcher nodded to the agents. "It is time to take out the trash," he said, his voice perfectly calm. The agents hauled Trent backward, dragging him away from the table. Trent fought them every step of the way, his heels scraping harshly against the gravel and concrete. He roared obscenities, his face twisted in ugly, desperate rage. They dragged him down the loading ramp and out into the blazing sunlight. They shoved him roughly into the back of a waiting transport SUV. He hit the reinforced steel cage inside with a heavy thud. The agent slammed the thick, armored doors shut, cutting off his screams instantly. The vehicle was completely soundproof. Trent Lawson was erased from the world. He was stripped of his stolen assets, stripped of his marriage, and stripped of his freedom. He was going to spend the next 2 decades in a concrete box, completely forgotten by the people he had tried to destroy. Fletcher closed his silver briefcase, snapping the locks shut. He picked it up and turned to me, offering a brief, respectful nod. The operation was a complete success. The target had been neutralized with absolute precision. The collateral damage to the family had been entirely mitigated. He turned and walked out toward his vehicle, leaving me alone in the empty warehouse. I stood in the silence for a long time, listening to the distant engines of the federal convoy driving away. The air inside the building was still thick with dust, but it no longer felt suffocating. I rolled my shoulders, stretching the muscles in my back, after days of playing a crippled old man. I walked out of the warehouse and stepped into the warm afternoon air. Audrey was standing by my rental car parked near the edge of the industrial park. She was looking up at the sky, taking a slow, deep breath of the fresh air. I walked up beside her. I did not speak. I did not need to offer any false comfort or unnecessary apologies. We stood side by side in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The parasite had been surgically removed. My brother Miles was safe in his recovery facility, and his home was completely secure. The family had survived the silent reckoning. I opened the car door, and we drove away, leaving the ruins of Trent Lawson far behind us. The drive back to the psychiatric facility took less than an hour, but the transition from the decaying industrial park to the pristine, manicured grounds of the hospital felt like crossing between 2 different dimensions. The violent chaos of the warehouse was entirely behind me. I parked the rental car in the visitor lot, letting the engine idle for a moment before turning the key. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, soft shadows across the perfectly cut grass. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main entrance, keeping my posture straight and my stride even. I did not need to play the broken, stooped old man anymore. The receptionist offered a polite, professional smile as I bypassed the waiting area and headed directly for the secure residential wing. I swiped my temporary access card against the heavy electronic lock. The thick wooden door clicked open, granting me entry into the quiet, isolated hallway. I walked down the carpeted corridor until I reached room 412. I paused for a single second, resting my hand on the smooth brass handle. The heavy adrenaline that had fueled my actions for the past 3 days was slowly draining from my bloodstream. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind me. The room was bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon. The air smelled of clean cotton and mild antiseptic. Miles was sitting in a comfortable leather chair positioned directly next to the large reinforced window. He was looking out at the facility gardens, watching the wind move gently through the oak branches. He turned his head slowly as I entered. The transformation in his physical appearance was profound. The deep purple bruising around his shattered orbital bone had faded into a dull yellowish brown. The swelling in his split lip had completely subsided, leaving only a thin pink scar. The perpetual tension that had gripped his shoulders for 5 years was entirely gone. He looked incredibly tired, but he also looked completely rested. The deep, exhausted bags under his eyes had smoothed out. The hunted, terrified look of a man living with a violent predator had vanished from his expression. He looked at me, taking in the familiar clothes I was wearing. He offered a slow, genuine smile. I walked over to the small wardrobe near the hospital bed. I began to unbutton the thick gray cardigan I had worn to impersonate him. I slipped it off my shoulders and folded it neatly, placing it on the mattress. I took off the heavy orthotic shoes and the faded corduroy trousers. Every piece of clothing I removed felt like shedding a massive physical weight. The persona of the helpless victim fell away completely. I retrieved my own tailored suit from the garment bag hanging in the closet. I put on the crisp white shirt and the dark wool trousers. I fastened my leather belt and slipped into my polished Oxfords. The physical transformation back into the forensic accountant was absolute. Miles watched me dress in complete silence. He did not ask about Trent. He did not ask about the warehouse or the federal agents. He simply waited for me to deliver the final verdict. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a pristine dark leather portfolio. I walked across the room and stood beside his chair. I held the portfolio out to him. He reached up with a steady hand and took the heavy leather folder. He opened the brass clasp and folded back the cover. Inside rested a thick stack of crisp legal documents bearing official federal watermarks and heavy embossed seals. I told him he was looking at the absolute restoration of his life. I explained that Trent Lawson had been completely liquidated. I told him every single offshore account, every hidden ledger, and every illegal credit line had been seized by the federal government. I told him Trent was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell, awaiting federal indictment for wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. He would never step foot in the suburbs again. I pointed to the document resting at the very top of the stack. I told him that was the original deed to his home. I explained that Fletcher and my legal team had restructured his entire estate while I was securing the warehouse. The house and all of his remaining financial assets were now locked inside an ironclad, irrevocable blind trust. The trust required 3 independent signatures from court, appointed fiduciaries, to execute any future property transfers or financial liquidations. I told him his home was a fortress. No corrupt notary and no aggressive son-in-law could ever touch his legacy again. The estate was permanently shielded from any external manipulation. Miles stared down at the documents. His eyes filled with heavy, silent tears. They were not tears of pain or terror. They were the tears of a man who had just been handed back his entire existence. He ran his thumb over the embossed seal on the deed, feeling the tangible proof of his salvation. He looked up at me, his expression filled with a profound, overwhelming gratitude. All the years of silent suffering and hidden abuse were finally validated and resolved. He opened his mouth to thank me, but his voice cracked and failed. I held up my hand, stopping him before he could force the words out. I told him he did not owe me any gratitude. I told him he was my brother, and I would have burned the entire city to the ground to keep him safe. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength returning to his frame. He took a slow, ragged breath and looked back out the window. He asked me about Audrey. His voice was thick with paternal concern. He knew the psychological toll the afternoon must have taken on his daughter. I told him Audrey was entirely safe. I explained how she had stood in the center of the warehouse and looked her abuser directly in the eyes. I told him how she had dropped her wedding ring into the dirt and walked away without a single ounce of fear. I told him she was waiting for him at the house, ready to help him move his things back into the master bedroom. The psychological chains Trent had wrapped around her mind were completely severed. She was a free woman, and she was ready to have her father back. Miles nodded slowly, closing the leather portfolio and resting it against his chest. He looked at the setting sun and closed his eyes, letting the warm light wash over his face. The long nightmare was officially over. The silent reckoning had restored the balance. I turned and walked toward the heavy wooden door, leaving him to enjoy the perfect, absolute peace of his reclaimed kingdom. The yellow cab turned onto the quiet suburban street, bringing Miles Becker back to the life that had been stolen from him. He stepped out of the vehicle, onto the warm concrete pavement. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the pristine front lawn. Trent's expensive sports car was permanently missing from the driveway. The suffocating, oppressive atmosphere that had choked the property for 5 years was completely eradicated. Miles walked slowly toward the front porch, looking at the house he had built with his own 2 hands. It was no longer a prison designed to break his spirit. It was a home again. Before he could reach the top step, the heavy oak door swung open. Audrey stood in the threshold. The rigid, terrifying tension that used to dictate her every movement had vanished entirely. Her shoulders were dropped and relaxed. The heavy makeup she used to wear to hide the faint yellow bruising on her cheeks was completely washed away. Her face was clean and bright. She looked at her father, and her expression crumpled into a mask of pure, overwhelming relief. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and threw her arms tightly around his neck. She buried her face in his shoulder, weeping with absolute, total abandon. They were not the silent, terrified tears of a battered wife trying to hide her misery from a monster. They were the loud, messy tears of a daughter who had finally found her way back to her protector. Miles wrapped his arms around her, holding her fiercely against his chest. He rested his chin against her hair, letting his own tears fall silently into the fabric of her shirt. He told her everything was going to be all right. He promised her that the long nightmare was permanently finished. They stood together on the porch, holding on to each other, as the evening shadows stretched across the quiet street. The psychological chains had been completely severed. They were finally free to rebuild their lives without fear. Miles was safe. I knew this with absolute certainty as I stood by the reinforced glass window of room 412. I watched the dust settle on the long, winding road leading away from the psychiatric facility. The yellow cab carrying my brother had disappeared beyond the front security gates minutes ago. But I remained by the glass, letting the deep, satisfying calm wash over me. The heavy, toxic adrenaline that had fueled my actions for the past 3 days was finally draining from my bloodstream. The operation was a complete success. The parasite had been surgically removed, and the host was going to survive. I turned away from the window and surveyed the quiet residential room. The faded gray cardigan and the heavy orthotic shoes sat neatly folded on the edge of the mattress. They were a discarded costume from a very dangerous play. I walked over to the small kitchenette in the corner of the room. I picked up the glass carafe and poured myself a cup of black coffee. The dark, bitter liquid warmed my throat as I took a slow, deliberate sip. The physical transformation back into my true self was absolute. The frail, stooped posture of the terrified victim was gone. My spine was straight, and my hands were perfectly steady. I walked back towards the small wooden desk positioned near the window. A thick manila envelope rested squarely in the center of the desk. Fletcher had left it there before he departed for the federal field office. I set my coffee cup down and picked up the heavy package. I slid my thumb under the paper flap, tearing it open with a single smooth motion. I pulled out a thick stack of printed ledgers and forensic audit reports. The top page bore the official blue seal of the Federal Tactical Accounting Division. It was a brand new target. I spread the documents out across the smooth wooden desk. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the table, and began to scan the intricate columns of hidden numbers. It was another arrogant predator bleeding a vulnerable family dry through a complex web of offshore shell companies and illegal real estate trusts. The familiar thrill of the hunt began to hum softly in my veins. The complex financial labyrinth laid out before me was not a confusing puzzle. It was a clear, illuminated map leading directly to the absolute destruction of a guilty man. Every hidden transaction and every falsified signature was a deliberate clue pointing toward the final reckoning. I took another sip of the black coffee and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I traced my finger down a column of fraudulent wire transfers calculating the exact trajectory of the embezzlement. The people who committed these crimes always believed they were untouchable. They hid behind heavy oak doors and expensive lawyers thinking their money shielded them from any real consequences. They never expected a phantom to walk directly into their lives and dismantle their entire existence from the inside out. The profound silence of the isolated hospital room wrapped around me like a heavy protective blanket. The quiet air was no longer filled with the fearful anticipation of a broken old man hiding from his abuser. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The silence in the room was no longer a retreat. It was a fortress. It was a secure tactical command center where I could meticulously plan the downfall of men who preyed on the weak. I pulled the first audit ledger closer to my coffee cup and picked up a black pen. The silent reckoning for Trent Lawson was complete, but my work was never truly finished. I was already preparing for the next war. The ultimate lesson woven throughout this narrative is that true power does not reside in loud aggression or cruel manipulation. Real strength lies in absolute patience, meticulous observation, and the quiet gathering of truth. Abusers like Trent rely on the illusion of control and the silence of their victims to maintain their fragile empires. However, when that silence is weaponized and transformed into a calculated strategy, the power dynamic is permanently inverted. Justice is rarely achieved through blind fury. It is secured through the cold, relentless application of facts, proving that no one is ever truly untouchable. Please share your thoughts on this conclusion, and let me know if you would like to explore another thrilling narrative.